Good afternoon and welcome to the second in a series of 4 webinars being delivered by NCARF. Throughout the webinar you can lodge your questions by using the on-screen question and answer box next to this video stream. The video of this webinar will be made available on the NCARF website in coming weeks. So the topic for this afternoon's webinar is trade aid and tourism under climate change. I'm the moderator or chair for this webinar, and I'm Jean Polutikov, and I'm from NCARF at Griffith University. So I have 2 colleagues with me today. I have John Barnett from the University of Melbourne and Cheryl Durant from the Department of Defence. So in many ways the topic of this webinar is actually a little bit broader than what we initially advertised. It's really going to try and cover off in no more than an hour trade aid, security and tourism under climate change. But first let me tell you a little bit about NCARF in case you're not familiar with what we do. We're based here in Australia, and our job is to develop and deliver knowledge to support adaptation in Australia. We're a national organisation set up by the Commonwealth Government. And as well as developing and delivering that knowledge, we also try to build capacity among the adaptation research and practice communities to develop the knowledge and to use it. As part of our activities, we've produced some policy information briefs. These are documents with 6 pages. You can see the subject of today's webinar on the right-hand side of this slide. They have 6 pages, and they target key challenges and locations under climate change in Australia. The policy information briefs are focused on policymakers in state and federal government, and if you want to have a look at them, you can download them from our website. So as I said, one of these policy information briefs is targeted on the subject of this afternoon's webinar, and the basic premise is that the impacts of climate change beyond Australia's borders pose risks which may be as great or greater than the impacts we experience at home. So because it's perhaps a little bit more straightforward and a little bit more tractable, we tend to look at the impacts within the borders of the nation, to study those and to evaluate the risks that they pose both to our livelihood and our welfare and to our natural environment. It's much more difficult to try to look at the interrelationships that take place between the nation and the wider world, and what might be happening in the wider world that poses risks for Australia related to climate change. But nevertheless, those risks do exist, and as I say, they may be as great or greater than the impacts we experience at home. Just to have a look at a couple of little things that you can pick up from what's going on around us. If you look at global wheat prices since 1987, you can see in the long-term trend since 1987 that there are price spikes, and these can be explained by a combination of low stocks, rising demand, and unfavourable weather in producing regions. So if you find that climate change is producing more events when unfavourable weather is affecting yields, then there are global implications both in the supply regions in terms of the price that's earned in overseas currencies, and also in the demand regions where you may end up having, for example, food riots, and examples of these have occurred, for example, in Mexico. Agriculture is important to Australia, so Australian farmers support an export market valued at more than 41 million Australian dollars per year, and that represents over 13% of export revenue. So what will happen to agriculture internationally does have important implications for Australia. I also, in thinking about this webinar today, did go to look at what's happening in the United States because it's so critical internationally in thinking about interrelationships between Australia and the wider world. And it turns out, in thinking about security issues, that the Department of Defence in the United States is very well aware of climate change and its implications. And here's just one quote from their Quadrennial Defence Review in 2014. Climate change may increase the frequency, scale and complexity of future missions, including defence support to civil authorities, while at the same time undermining the capacity of our domestic installations to support training activities. The pressure caused by climate change will influence resource competition while placing additional burdens on economies, societies and governance institutions around the world. These effects are threat multipliers. So we're not alone in thinking that international impacts of climate change have implications both to Australia and to the United States, and these are things that we need to take account of. So that's enough from me. And I'd now like to hand over to our distinguished speakers today, and the first one is John Barnett. John is a professor in the Department of Resource Management and Geography at Melbourne University. He's a political geographer whose research investigates the impacts of and responses to climate change on social systems, with a focus on risks to human insecurity, hunger, violent conflict and water stress. He's done extensive fieldwork in the South Pacific, China and East Timor. So John will speak for about 10 minutes and then there will be the opportunity for questions before we go on to our second speaker. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Jane. So as Jane said, the issue I think we're talking about today is about the way climate change may affect Australia through its impacts on all those things in which Australia is embedded. We're embedded in a world economy. Not just global climate affects Australia, but also the flow of ideas, the flow of goods, legal and illegal, the flow of services, the flow of finance, the flow of people. And while we are much more confident about what climate change might mean for our domestic systems, we have a lot of uncertainty about how it may affect the way we engage in the world. But it's, as a highly globalised economy and a highly globalised society, we should be very concerned about the impacts of climate change on all those societies and places with which we engage economically, politically and culturally. So to put some numbers around this, in terms of trade, we are a highly trade-exposed economy. About 21% of our GDP is traded, is exported. We have about 135,000 farm businesses. About 60% of their production is traded. So the implications on climate change for Australian agricultural producers are very much about Australia's competitiveness in a world of climate change. It's not just what happens to domestic production here, it's what happens to prices and what happens to the Australian currency and so on is going to have a really big impact on Australian farmers. And they're managing all those trade-related risks at the same time as they're managing climate-related risks. There are 48,000 other firms involved in exporting a total of $330 billion of goods and services out of our economy. So it's hugely important how Australia fares in the global economy. The global economy will be impacted by climate change increasingly into the future. A lot of those exports are in climate-sensitive sectors: agriculture, forestry, fishing and tourism. Tourism is in fact by far and away the largest of our climate-sensitive trading sectors, and so tourism, the impact of climate change on tourism is very important. So we know a fair bit, or there's been a lot of research about the way climate change might impact upon the profitability of Australian agricultural producers and tourist operators, but not much at all about how it may affect their competitiveness. What happens to Australian wheat exports, as Jane pointed out? What happens to our beef exports into China relative to our competitors into the markets in which we export? And it's very, very important to try and understand that more. And it's equally true for tourism too. Research on climate change and tourism tends to focus on the effect of climate change on tourism enterprises, on costs, rather than on our position in the markets with which we compete for international tourists. But tourists who come to Australia do choose amongst multiple markets, and climate change might be a factor on their choices. There is some evidence that disasters deter tourism. There is some evidence that news stories about dramatic impacts, for example, on coral reefs deter tourism and undermines demand for the Australian economy. There's also some evidence that a positive reputation for environmental stewardship increases demand. So we can see signs that the tourism economy is also sensitive to climate change. There are, of course, a whole range of other variables: the value of the Australian dollar, the price of fuel, the cost of transport, the ability of which we market, barriers and entry into and out of the economy, and all those variables may themselves be subjected to climate change, but we have no understanding, for example, about the effect of climate change on the Australian dollar. Let me talk a bit about aid. Australia's aid program is responding to climate change. About 6% of our official development assistance is now invested into clean energy and adaptation in sectors such as water infrastructure, sanitation, water management. So 6% of our ODA budget directed towards climate things is about to figure. Whether that's a high figure or a low figure depends a bit on how you think the world should work. Of our official development assistance, 21% is spent in Papua New Guinea and the Pacific Island countries, 26% is spent in East Asia. Very interesting figure if you look at the reporting on Australia's official development assistance. The money that we spend on humanitarian and disaster response in Papua New Guinea and the Pacific Islands quadrupled between 2005 and 2014. So we're spending more and more on climate-related disaster response in the region, which is an interesting trend indeed. Given high rates of population growth and urbanisation, given exposure to environment and climate change, there's almost certainly going to be increasing demand for humanitarian assistance through the Australian aid program. There will certainly be increasing demand for Australian logistics and response to assist with humanitarian emergencies in the Pacific and Papua New Guinea. So 3 key points about this. The impacts of climate change on Australian society won't just be a function of changes in our climate. We are highly exposed to changes in countries with which we exchange goods and services and people, which are important for our economy, which are important for our security. Many of the risks climate change poses to Australia will flow across our borders. It may alter the competitiveness of our exporters, undermine peace and prosperity in our region, create new tensions that may be have to be managed through foreign policy. When we conducted workshops around this policy briefing, there was a lot of discussion about trade-offs between the Australian government's domestic and foreign responsibilities. What might happen if we had an extreme bushfire season in southeastern Australia, an extreme cyclone season in northern Australia, and significant disasters, climate-related disasters in the Pacific concurrently? How will we make choices about where we spend our money? How will we make choices about where we deploy our Commonwealth assets to deal with those resources? We may be facing a world where suddenly our public resources are being required to do an awful lot more into the future. We also talked a lot about the opportunities that climate change creates for Australian trade and aid to enhance prosperity at home and abroad. We have competitive advantages in research and development. We're very good in our agricultural sector at adapting to climate change. We're very advanced in knowledge about adapting our natural resources and our resource management strategies to deal with climate change. We're quite advanced in providing urban resilience in our cities. We have a sophisticated energy technology sector. We have lots of knowledge that we could be exporting and which we could be bringing into our immediate region to help build climate resilience and promote peace and prosperity. And we have a responsibility as a leader in our region to do that. So climate change doesn't just present risks, it also presents opportunities. We thought about 5 actions to prepare Australia for the challenges and opportunities that climate change presents in our trade and aid sector. We felt that increasing research and development for adaptation and mitigation technologies, particularly in export-oriented sectors such as agriculture, would be a good strategy for building domestic capability and sharing that capability to adapt with countries in our region. We felt that there was much more that needed to be done to understand the potential impacts of climate change on Australia's engagement and relationships with the world through scenario planning, cross-agency scenario planning, building better links between government agencies to develop a whole-of-government response, and long-term foresight exercises as other countries and intelligence agencies conduct to try and set a range of parameters about what the future might bring and think about how we might plan for those in the future. We felt, given population growth and urbanisation, that Australia needed to do much more to support climate change adaptation and disaster resilience in our region, in the Asia-Pacific region, including the development and implementation of adaptation plans, particularly focused on urban sectors, since most of the world's future population growth, and also true in our region, will be urban growth. And we have a moral responsibility to do that, and if we are failing to engage proactively with adaptation and to build resilience in our region, then ultimately our society will suffer for that failure. And finally, we felt that the challenges of proactive and significant foreign policy and aid policy in Australia partly rested on the ability to build a mandate for that within the Australian population, and so raising awareness about the risks climate change poses and the opportunities it creates for Australia in terms of our engagement in the region was also something we think that's very important. So that as a whole society, we understand that we are engaged in the world and that the world is changing, and we need to change the way that we engage in this increasingly turbulent world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So I've got a couple of questions here for you. So the first one is, are we getting the balance right between mitigation and adaptation?
We're certainly not doing great on mitigation in this country. I think we need to be doing an awful lot more of both. Is there a balance? I think we should be as much mitigation as we can achieve. We're probably not doing anywhere near as much as we could. I think most people would agree with that. Our energy policy is a mess. We are certainly, I don't think, contributing enough to building adaptation in our region as well, or indeed in Australia. So it's not a balance, it's not enough of either.
What about globally?
Our contribution globally, or as a global...
As a global problem? I mean, our contribution globally is probably a bit less than we should be making, given the size of our population and our level of GDP.
I think that's right. I think we're certainly lagging in our efforts on mitigation globally. We're by no means a leader on mitigation, which is disappointing. I think over the time that I've seen this, Australian governments have been very inconsistent in their support for adaptation, particularly through our international engagement, and a great deal more consistency in our position on this would be very helpful. We make contributions to global funds, but we're very on and off again bilaterally with countries in our regions, and I think a consistent long-term programmatic response would be a very good thing. I think in general reductions in our aid budget are not sending a positive signal and not creating the opportunity for us to be contributing enough to adaptation in the region.
So, just to slip in a question from myself, yesterday I spent a bit of time watching the House inquiry by the Committee of Science in the United States into climate change and the scientific method, and I have to say I was absolutely appalled. But I wonder then what the change in focus in the United States, what do you think it's going to mean for Australia and globally? I have an opinion on that, but I'm interested to know what you think.
I think your opinion would be worth more than mine, Jane. I think we really feel in the Australian scientific community, I think everybody feels that we're going to need to do an awful lot more as the United States does less. And I think that's true in every sector, including science and climate research. And I think that's very unfortunate. But the burden of work, I think, is even more coming onto us now. If we're going to tackle climate change properly, we're going to have to do it probably with much less of a contribution from the United States in every area, including science. We're going to have to do an awful lot more.
At least for 4 years.
Yeah.
Here's another question from the audience, and it's about food. Is food likely to be our biggest trade challenge or opportunity under climate change, or are there other vulnerable industries that we can't immediately identify?
Yeah, I think in terms of income, tourism is far more significant than agricultural exports. I know that rural people don't want to hear that, but we make much more money from tourism than we do from agricultural exports. It's difficult to say what the impact of climate change will be on tourism. I want to stress in all this stuff that good marketing, long-term business planning and a strategic response in both tourism and agriculture is really, really important. And the demise, I think, of marketing boards under microeconomic reform in this country, I think, has probably left us less well prepared for a world in which probably marketing is going to have to do more and more and more to maintain our competitiveness. The modelling on what climate change might mean for food production and food exports from Australia is very, very unreliable. It basically shows, though, that for what it's worth, under very severe climate change, Australia will do relatively better than our competitors in grain markets. Under moderate degrees of climate change, we will do relatively worse than our competitors in global trade markets, for whatever that is worth. My general sense, but maybe this is just my political predilection, is that if we're going to enter in a world of greater uncertainty and more strategic uncertainty, we probably need to be far more strategic in the organisation of our export sectors. We're going to need much more foresight planning, much more thinking about changes in markets, much greater engagement in trade forums, much greater thinking around marketing and the organisation of production and exports in this country than we currently have. If we're going to protect our economy, we need to do much better on all those non-climate related aspects that determine our competitiveness, and at the moment I think we've probably not very well prepared in that respect.
So there's a couple of questions here, I'll put them together, about tourism. So I think that struck a chord, maybe with the discussion around the Great Barrier Reef. Are there any opportunities for tourism under climate change? And how do we help tourism businesses now? How do we help them to plan?
I don't know enough about tourism to answer those questions with any confidence. I think we should be certainly thinking about opportunities. I think in general, as always with climate change, we only think negative. We only think about negative futures and we don't think about positives and opportunities. So I think we should turn to think about opportunities. And in all those, if you think that adaptation is a competitive advantage, then probably we have one in the tourism economy, in the agricultural economy. So how can we turn what we know about environmental stewardship, the knowledge that we have and the work that organisations like NCARF have done, into advantages in the global tourism market? Will we be adapting better in our tropical tourism economy or tropical tourism sector, for example, than our competitors? Possibly. Will we be a more stable political environment into the future relative to our competitors in the global tourism market? Probably. So there may be opportunities. We may become more competitive and a more preferable destination for tourism in a world of increasing uncertainty, given that a lot of our competitor countries are developing countries who may not adapt so well, who may face greater instability into the future. So there may be opportunities there. They're not ones we should relish from a moral point of view, but from a domestic economy point of view, there may be opportunities there. How can we help? I just don't know enough about this, but the literature talks about long-term business planning and maintaining business continuity across tourism sectors. We know, for example, in the ski tourism sector, that diversification to bring in tourists off-season is very important and becomes an increasingly large share of their revenue model. So thinking about the way change might occur and the way tourism firms may adapt to those changes is important. That requires information. It may require government support for forms of adjustment at the firm level. I think that collectively there isn't a lot of industry level organisation around tourism. I don't know what scope there is for that, but we tend not to think about tourism as an economic sector that is kind of collectively managed, and one wonders what the scope for improvement there might be.
So, another question related to tourism. Air travel contributes to a growing proportion of emissions. Won't tourism decline if we have an effective carbon price globally?
Some debate about that, and I don't really know the answer. I do know that almost all the future growth in global tourism economy is going to come from China. And so it's really, you can narrow this down to the effect of any energy taxes or any energy price increases from Australian point of view, tourists coming out of China. We're not as far from China as perhaps some of our competitors are. Whether that makes a difference, I don't know. But the future of world tourism is the future of China's tourism.
Okay, so just to move away from tourism for a moment, and here's one about the import and export regime. So when will we start needing to change our import-export regime? Will we ever start exporting less because we need to keep it for ourselves?
This is, I think, probably a food question.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, it's a good question about gas. Yeah, probably now with gas, actually, that's a very good point.
Gas is a proxy.
Well, gas is an excellent proxy, and if that is any evidence to go by, the answer is no. Well, we won't be retaining anything for domestic consumption, and we'll be paying whatever the world market price is for everything that we export is under the current trade arrangements that we have. I think it's very interesting that we have a very deregulated trade policy in this country. We have been very strongly committed to free trade and to the liberalisation of trade globally, and we have adjusted our policies at the border accordingly. That might not stand us in very good stead into the future. We may well see increasingly into the future countries taking negotiating positions into World Trade Organisation forums that are seeking to protect their economies with climate change in mind. We might need to think about whether or not we need to begin to protect our export economies, our agricultural export economies, our energy export economies with climate change in mind as well. Climate change is having a fingerprint, and will increasingly have a fingerprint on how we export and import with the world, and that may very well then play through into, or should perhaps play through into our policies. They may include strategic reserves of grain, they may include strategic reserves of gas, they may include higher taxes on imports of certain commodities we feel we need to protect. They may include carbon taxes on imports of certain commodities from countries that we feel are not lifting their weight on climate change. There's a whole range of issues that ought to be, we may need to think about in a future where climate change is having an impact on the way we trade.
Here's another question about a rather leading question from around tourism. Can the government initiate a peak planning body for tourism operators now in relation to long-term planning?
Well, I think they should, but I don't know that there's much of a history or a culture of that in the tourism sector. One doesn't get a sense of that. I say I'm not a great expert on studying climate change and tourism, but you always get the impression that it's very much the scale of focus is always very local and very much at the firm level, and so a larger scale form of organisation seems to be difficult to achieve, but I think it wouldn't hurt. It's worth a lot of money, and there's a lot of jobs dependent on it, and how the tourism sector responds to climate change is very interesting, not just for the tourist economy, and so certainly some forms of response of, and we know this globally, declining coral reefs in one tourist area just lead a relocation to new coral reefs that cause further degradation. So this is constant consumption of environmental amenity to the tourism sector. That's something I think we need to be mindful of. There may be more pressure on expansion into currently protected areas. This may be true in the alpine areas as well, that as the snow cover declines, ski resorts may seek to move higher. They then may put pressure on the use of conservation areas. And so it's not just about protecting a strategic view about the sustainability of our tourism sector, it's also about the sustainability of our resources with respect to what the tourism sector does in terms of adapting to climate change. And so I think a collective response and a longer term vision is necessary.
So somebody here would like to just thank you for speaking about the moral responsibilities of climate change. I
can do more of that.
Well, let's just stick to a few more questions to give people the opportunity to hear what you think more broadly. Can Australia be liable for future legal action for failing to act in the face of climate change?
There's been a few developments around this. Tuvalu thought about mounting a court case against the United States for the impacts of climate change on Tuvalu. I think legally it would be very difficult to do. There's not a very strong legal forum through which this might occur. And the attribution of any given impact in a country to climate change as opposed to natural variability is very hard to detect. So Cyclone Pam in Tuvalu, for example, if we take that example, how much of Cyclone Pam was attributed to climate change versus a natural cyclone of that magnitude? Very hard to determine. If you could even determine what that additional magnitude was, is that an extra 10 kilometres an hour in the wind? How does that translate into an economic cost or a loss in Tuvalu, and then how would you apportion that cost according to emissions? That actually apportioning the cost to the emissions is not the hardest part of this. even if you could do that, even if you could construct that train of evidence, then you would need an international court that had sufficient authority that would be able to create some sort of binding outcome on the countries that were considered responsible. It may be possible to attribute that to certain firms. Ironically, probably if you were to apportion greenhouse gas emissions to single institutions, you were probably looking at defence departments. The US Department of Defence would be responsible for a fair whack of global emissions. But you have to bring them to court, you have to identify a payment vehicle and so on. So it seems very unlikely. I think that the legal route will not create any impetus to build emissions of greenhouse gas reductions, are probably even less likely than the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I don't think that's the way we're going to solve this problem.
Okay, thank you, John. So there's one more question here, which is quite popular. 5 people have voted for it, but I'm going to just let it rest until the end because I think Cheryl might want also to speak to this, but I'll let you know what it is now so you can ponder it. How many of the effects of resource scarcity are related to population and how much to climate change? So I'll leave that one with you and just move us along because time is slipping away from us. But I'll repeat that question at the end if we have chance. So Cheryl Durant is our second speaker today, and she currently works in the Vice Chief of the Defence Force Group as Director Preparedness and Mobilisation. And there she provides independent advice and analysis to senior defence decision makers. Part of this work includes leading Defence's Global Change and Energy Sustainability Initiative, which she did from 2013 to 2016. In 2014, she was recognised as one of Defence's Women of Influence for her work on climate change and resilience. Cheryl, over to you.
Thank you, Jean, and thanks for the invite to speak here today, and thanks also for the work of NCARF in developing the policy briefs. I thoroughly enjoyed the workshop, and certainly I can say the policy briefs are read amongst government. I'm going to talk about climate change and security, also about aid, trade, but unfortunately not tourism. It's not one of the areas. While defence is a big portfolio, it does connect with many things, but tourism's not a biggie for us. So I'm going to briefly cover Defence's policy position on climate change and security. I'll then talk about our efforts in aid, particularly regional aid in the Pacific, a little bit about trade, and then I'll ask that question that we've been left posed with, I think. So Defence takes climate change very seriously, and like the US Department's view, which Jean put up earlier, we see climate change really as a threat multiplier. It just connects to so many things. And it has a range of both direct and indirect impacts on the department. So we first had this as a public policy position in our 2009 white paper. We talked a little bit more about it in 2013, and our most recent white paper, the 2016 white paper, has quite a substantial piece on climate change. That white paper looks at climate change really in 3 main areas. One, looking at the direct impact on Defence estate. Defence is one of the largest Commonwealth property owners, and we've pretty much got estate everywhere, and most of that estate is by the sea. So we did participate in the Coast Adapt workshops that NCARF pulled together, and we are, like the US Department of Defence, looking very seriously at what adaptation measures need to be adopted to ensure that we can continue to generate capability from the estate. The second one is the one that I think very prominent recently with Cyclone Debbie, but also Cyclone Winston a couple of years ago in Fiji, is our response to disasters. That's where most of our aid, if you like, from Defence is delivered. It's actually the point of disaster rather than preemptive or in the prevention phase. We do have some aid delivered there, but not as much as our response to disasters. And the final piece of where Defence sees climate change is in that contributor or threat multiplier to global conflict, and this is where it connects to trade, to tourism, to pretty much everything, because a sort of stable global order, which is functioning, doesn't require the application of defence forces, But if we see either through food shortages or collapse of global governance or regional governance, increasing conflict, that's when the application of defence tends to be required. And that's the one that's really hard to grip up. I think we have a fairly good understanding of direct impacts on a state, a reasonably good understanding of how increasing frequency of disasters is requiring more defence efforts. And this has been a long-term trend. It actually goes back to the early 1990s, where we can see an increasing trend in defence having to respond to events in our region. And in fact, we now even jokingly refer to this as Operation Deny Christmas, because both the peak of the fire and the cyclone season happens to be around December. There's also another peak in April. I'm not quite sure why that's the case. So focusing now on humanitarian and disaster relief, which we call HADAR. This is one of Defence's key missions, but most of the capabilities we have in this space are what we call dual-use capabilities. So they're not normally purposely built or purchased for the purpose of doing disaster relief. And in fact, many ways, while defence is often seen, it's not the first responder. Ideally, the responses are coming initially from capacities in local governments or state governments or regional governments, because it's an expensive and costly option to use Defence Force to deliver disaster relief. And there's also quite a bit of research that suggests that the money spent in the prevention and capacity building phase of disaster relief and building resilience is a more effective way. So this touches on some of those cross-portfolio points that John was touching earlier. It's the really need for the Australian government to look at how it's investing across its entire portfolio to respond to climate change. We do have quite an extensive exercise program in the Pacific, which does go to training and building capacity with regional partners. And we have over 14 defence exercises and training activities that specifically look at disaster response in the Pacific region. These are also conducted with Foreign Affairs and Trade as a partner in some of those activities, and also with the US, France and New Zealand. We have some new capabilities, the large ships that we deployed to Fiji, and these bring online quite substantial new capabilities that can respond to disasters. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the other part of our aid, which is our Defence Cooperation Program. So this has been running for, I think, since the 1960s, and it's about capacity building for regional partners. It has had increasing funding recently, and the focus is on training, capacity building, and also in Papua New Guinea support to construction. We do also have an interest in trade, and this really, Defence connects with trade in three ways. Firstly, a healthy global and regional trade contributes to prosperity generally and economically, and so a robust, effective Australian economy means that we have the money to basically fund the Defence Force. We can afford both guns and butter. And as you probably appreciate, defence spending is normally linked as a percentage of GDP, so the more effective Australia is and the more competitive it is, as John has said, under climate change, that also creates a competitive advantage for defence as well. Secondly, as you appreciate, Australia is at the end of many global supply chains, and it is a nation that requires both import and export, largely by sea but also by air, and there's a defence responsibility to protect those global supply chains if necessary. And finally, we actually do support Australian defence industry. Unlike the US, which has a substantial military defence industry, including also a carbon mitigation problem. But I would like to say on behalf of our US partners that actually they have quite an aggressive carbon mitigation policy, and some of you may have been involved or seen the visit of the Great Green Fleet to Australia last year, which is a US Navy initiative to fuel the elements of the US Navy with biofuels, and our current Chief of Navy put out a great little video on that. And here's a personal interest. He flew the first Australian certified biofuels helicopter onto an Australian vessel. So while we're a small player, we do have a new initiative, the Centre for Defence Industry Capability, and part of that is to help fund defence industry development, skilling and support exports. And one of the themes of that centre, in terms of what it's looking to seek in terms of innovative proposals from Australian industry, is an energy theme. So like the US, there is an interest in Australian defence, principally for the security and resilience building that alternative energy provides, to look at alternative energy technologies and how they can support the defence mission. So in conclusion, while we're not the lead on trade and aid and tourism, that's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Defence does have an interest in really anything that is a global issue, because almost anything that is a global issue creates a security environment that could be favourable or unfavourable to defence. The main impact of climate change to date has been in the change in our mission profiles, the increasing demand for humanitarian disaster relief. And just touching on that question, if I may, Jean, we have actually done some research looking at Pacific nation resiliency. There's really some quite excellent work that looks at population growths and resiliency of Pacific states, and certainly there is I think a correlation, what we see, between the exposures of larger populations as well as the climate events that come together in our region and create really some potential for quite substantial impacts. And then looking forward to that, further forward to that broader climate change as a threat multiplier, we hold a similar position as some of you may have seen with the film Age of Consequences that was screened earlier this year. While there's not that direct shooting gun from climate change to global conflict, climate change does put pressures on resources, it does put pressures on trade, it does put pressures on peoples, and all these themselves are drivers of conflict. So I'll close it there if I may.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. So there is actually a question about Australian responsibilities towards Pacific Island nations. So taking a climate change perspective on that, and in terms of adaptation, how do you see our responsibilities towards Pacific Island nations?
That's me.
Cheryl, it's yours.
I was going to say, where is DFAT here? So from a defence perspective, we have a particularly close relationship with Papua New Guinea, and that's where the bulk of our defence cooperation program is spent at the moment. And certainly we actually do a lot of exercising with Pacific Island nations as well, and capacity building. So I'm not sure there's necessarily a moral responsibility, but there certainly is a feeling that we have technologies and skills and capabilities, and we are very happy to share that with others in the region.
Do you wish to comment on that, John?
No, well, that's good.
So there's a question here about climate refugees. Just to forewarn you, what is considered a climate refugee? Are we seeing climate refugees at the present time, and what plans are there in place to deal with climate refugees? Would you like to kick us off, Cheryl?
So I won't specifically address the legal question, because I think there is a legal opinion on climate refugees, which is not my area of expertise. But certainly one of the things Defence is looking at, along with other government departments, is the issue of mass migration. At this stage, obviously, the countries that are being impacted in our region are not countries which have or generate large numbers of refugees. But that trend going forward, you can see the potential for large displacements of people, and there are, I'm aware, certainly with New Zealand Defence Forces, they actually have quite close arrangements with some Pacific countries. I think Tuvalu was mentioned earlier. I can't comment on any specific arrangements that we may have with Pacific nations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we hear a lot about the term climate refugees in the media and from NGOs. There's been quite a lot of work around this. I would refer you to the work of Jane McAdam at University of New South Wales in particular, who's a lawyer who studies refugee things. To paraphrase that, we're probably not seeing refugees caused by climate change if we define a refugee as somebody who crosses a border for fear of persecution or personal safety. Those people are people who are fearing war and violence. The people who may be moving because of climate change are making a much more considered decision, potentially because of declining environmental conditions. It's very hard to identify the fingerprint of environment in any migration decision at present, apart from people who are short-term displaced from extreme events. We know that certainly cyclones and floods do displace lots and lots of people. They don't often cross a border, they almost always return, so they're not refugees. They are certainly people triggered though by a climatic event. Climate change may be increasing that. It's not considered desirable to treat any potential further movements caused by climate change across a border, and refugees is a cross-border criteria, under the framework of the Refugee Convention for a couple of reasons. First, it's very hard, will always be very hard to attribute a movement in response to environmental change as opposed to a range of the other factors, which might be economic factors or political violence factors and so on. So it may create a lot of noise around the issue of refugees that is diverting from the real issue of refugees, which is that there are still millions of people crossing borders because they're afraid of being raped or killed by their governments or by warring groups. So I think we need to keep these issues quite separately. Those people are an issue. They have a convention, a way of dealing with them legally, and that's very, very important, and we shouldn't be probably contaminating that very, very serious and immediate present business with the potential long-term issue about whether climate change causes increasing international migration. So that's the kind of view on refugees. It's not actually a very helpful way of talking about it. If we're talking refugees as a legal opinion and the way we approach people move because of climate change through legal frameworks, it's better to think about this in terms of human rights, in terms of a human right to remain, which creates an imperative on reducing greenhouse gas emissions so people can live where they want to live, a human right to adaptation so that people can continue to live where they want to live, perhaps a human right to mobility so that people have a range of choices about where they could move to in a strategic, planned kind of way if they are experiencing declining environmental conditions, and certainly using human rights law and rights-based frameworks to protect the rights of migrants if they do move to other places so that they are treated as citizens, they are given equal property rights and so on, because we know that they are critical factors in determining the success of migration. In terms of the Pacific region, if I just say one more thing, I think it's seriously misleading to think about climate change driving refugees from most Pacific Island countries, because people are not going to walk across a border from Tuvalu or Kiribati into Australia as they walk across the border from one African country to another. They're not going to be able to leave their countries. Anybody who can leave a Pacific Island country and arrive on Australia or New Zealand is wealthy enough to afford an airfare, has a passport, is able to negotiate border controls, probably has a certain level of literacy and vocational training, and probably also has a family member and a pre-existing association with Australia and New Zealand. That is a very, very, very small proportion of the population of those countries. The problem here is the people who can't leave, who may be trapped in deteriorating environmental conditions, and that's going to be a massive humanitarian problem that's going to create demand on our defence, our aid, our foreign affairs programs, our NGOs and so on. So thinking about the Pacific in terms of refugees as if that's a problem for us is thinking about this issue all wrong.
So nobody touched on the issue of internal refugees, but of course in Australia we do have our own islands up in the Torres Strait, which are likely to be the first to be impacted to the extent that it may be necessary for them to relocate. I wonder, is any thought being given to that or to them?
Do you want to answer that?
No, I'm not aware of any particular thought.
I wouldn't be refugees, they would be because they wouldn't cross the border, but I think it's an issue.
Well, that's just a matter of definition, isn't it?
Well, I take your point. People forcibly displaced. I think it's really careful we don't talk on behalf of those people and what they say. I think I would take as a matter of principle, and this is, I think, from the work I've done in the Pacific, that the people ought to have a choice to stay, and that is an a priori policy target rather than thinking about how we might deal with them if they can't stay. And so that puts a significant burden, I think, on the emphasis of adaptation and supporting those people to stay. And we're talking about communities with long cultures and long histories that are intrinsically valuable. And so the first line of approaching this must be adaptation, I think. And I think there's a real danger, and we know this in the Pacific Islands, that if we immediately talk to the question of relocation, we undermine the question of adaptation. We say, well, we're moving to the second step and giving up on the first step of adaptation. We don't know what adaptation could and couldn't do if we tried very hard to enable people to live on the places where they live, and I think that has to be the priority. And there's another reason why the question of migration is a little bit tricky. It's very sensational, we like it, but we shouldn't be giving up on adaptation and rushing to migration. We haven't really tried on adaptation yet. We haven't really thought very much about it. We haven't really committed the kind of resources and effort that we need to do that, and so that, I think, has to be the priority.
Yes. Another one for you, Cheryl. What do you credit for the forward thinking of the Australian Defence Force in the area of climate change adaptation? And a second question from the same person, how is the Defence Force working with other government departments?
Okay, so the first one, I think there's really two drivers of why Defence Forces have been forward thinking on climate change. One is we actually have a history of forward thinking. Most of our equipments take years, sometimes decades to purchase, acquire, and are then used for years and or decades onwards. So we tend to have planning horizons that are longer than most other government departments and even some businesses. So we're often looking out 25, 50, 70 years ahead. The other thing is the one you wouldn't expect, because it actually comes from the personal experience of soldiers, sailors and airmen who are, as part of their jobs, they're actually out in the bush or the oceans or the environment pretty much every day. And in fact, at a Pacific Environmental Security Forum I attended some years ago, this was a common experience of many of the Pacific militaries. We were sharing stories of how the wattle was blooming at different seasons and how the fish were, different type of fish in the waters. So there's actually quite a strong connection between Defence Forces and the environment. It's the environment we operate in. And Jean, that second question, could you?
The second question was around relationships with other government departments.
Oh, good.
We have good relationships. We actually have, across government, I think it was one of the policy brief's recommendations was to have cross-government planning and scenario foresight. So that under the leadership of the Department of Environment and Energy and the Attorney General's Department, there now is a number of working groups in government right through to the Secretary's Group on Climate Risk, which is pulling together people from Defence and other government departments to develop a collective understanding of the risks and start looking at how policy responses can be best implemented across government. And one of the tasks Defence has is to support that Secretary's Group on Climate Risk with some of those climate scenarios and foresight activities that John was talking about, because that's part of our business. We have a history of doing that and can bring some resources to help other government departments in that space.
So just a last rather general question to you, Cheryl, before we go back to population and climate change. What are the big challenges for the defence industry under climate change?
I think defence industry, there's more opportunities rather than challenges. Certainly defence equipments will have to be developed under different specifications. Simple things like more energy in the atmosphere and more energy in the oceans means that vessels, planes and ships will need to be capable of greater range of temperature extremes, capable of responding to different levels of sea states. And so going back to John's point of competitiveness, a defence industry that's thinking ahead and thinking of factor into these things is going to have a competitive advantage in that space. There's also, I think, quite a substantial opportunity in the energy space as well, because things that defence wants from energy systems, which is resilience, security against supply disruptions, storage, are the same things that actually domestic suppliers are wanting. It's also the same things that vulnerable countries in our region are wanting as well. And so Defence has invested a number of projects. One which I think is on the Coast Adapt as a best case study is the Carnegie Island wave generator at Garden Island West, which is our major naval base in the west. And that's looking now at an integrated microgrid with wave and solar energy systems, and also connecting that into the generation of water for that base. So it's basically giving us a much greater capacity and much greater resilience, and at the same time there's a technology there, or a collection of technologies, that certainly is attractive across trade and aid and not quite tourism, but you can come and see do a bit of tourism or looking at alternate wave generators if you like.
Okay, so back to this question that's now the most popular on the board in front of me. How many of the effects of resource scarcity are related to population and how much to climate change, if you can disaggregate those? John, do you want to say a few words about that?
I've got many things to say about that.
Yes.
I think it depends on what resource you're talking about. But we would always assume, I think, that the issue is only partly how many people there are. It's probably more importantly how affluent they are and the technologies they use and what they consume. And so if you look at a per capita footprint analysis, by far the most overpopulated country in the world is the United States, which is not the most populous country, but they consume massive amounts of resources imported from all over the world. They pollute large quantities of greenhouse gas emissions, and Australia is no different. It's just that we're a smaller country. So the issue of scarcity very much depends on the resource, and it's very much a function of how resources are being used. If we look at greenhouse gas emissions, it's certainly true that it's much more about affluence and technology than it is about the absolute number of people. So Africa has a very high population, very high population growth, but very low greenhouse gas emissions. Water, certainly there are localised scarcities of water, but they're very localised. They're around pastoral areas in Africa, for example, or we have water scarcity or a shortage of water relative to demand in Australia as well, in the Murray-Darling Basin. Again, that's much more about consumption and affluence and production than it is about just the number of people. There are not that many farmers in the Murray-Darling Basin, but they use a lot of water. So I think simply counting the heads of people is missing the point on almost any environmental issue. It's certainly missing the point on greenhouse gas emissions. If the issue is about vulnerability to climate change, and Cheryl said this before, then I think we are certainly seeing in many parts of the world, and certainly in many parts of our region, that high population growth is exposing more people to climate change. High population growth that outstrips the capacity of economies to provide jobs, and governments and economies to provide infrastructure and shelter and food at the same time as climate is changing, is increasing vulnerability to climate change quite significantly. And as I said before, that's very much an urban problem. Most of the growth is going to be urban growth. But even there, actually, the kind of demographic changes that we're looking at are not just about the absolute number of people, it's also about the composition of populations. And so we know in Australia, for example, or in many parts of the developed world, that ageing populations also create particular forms of vulnerability. Higher vulnerability to heat stress, for example, is a function partly of ageing populations. It's also partly a function of disaggregated populations where elderly people are living alone away from extended families. And so the relationships between population change and social vulnerability are much more nuanced than just how many people there are and where they are. It's also about the composition of societies. There's some suggestion and possibly some evidence that climate change maybe has the potential to undo the demographic transition, and so this process that we see of falling death rates and ultimately falling birth rates in some parts of the developing world, which is really driven by economic growth and education of women, may ultimately be undermined by climate change. If it stymies economic growth, we may still see falling birth rates, but still see very high death rates. And so the idea that all the world's populations may be going through a demographic transition and stabilising at relatively low birth and death rates may in fact be challenged, and that's by the effects of climate change on economic growth and on poverty. And that would be a very, very large impact of climate change on poverty in many parts of the world. So the population environment question is quite complicated. It's certainly much more than how many people there are fighting over a small number of resources.
We'll do a webinar on that next.
Yeah.
Cheryl, do you want
I'd just like to agree. It's a very
Yeah.
complex one. We've been looking at Malthusian biology and the curve for a long time, and it hasn't really quite come to fruition, because there's not only the growth of demand, if you like, with increasing population growth, there's complex interactions between climate change and supply of resources. In some countries, they're potentially for more resources to be generated. And there's also that factor of technology and human ingenuity, because technology, there's fabulous things in terms of every depressing announcement on climate change, there's a fabulous announcement on how new crops are dealing with different heat ranges, and there's some really interesting stuff happening with hydroponics and undersea farms for food. So it's really, I think you're right, there's probably about 2 or 3 webinars on that one alone, Jean.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you to everyone. To the panellists, to John and to Cheryl for coming here to Brisbane today to participate in this webinar, and thank you to the audience and for your very interesting and insightful, sometimes challenging questions. So I'd just like to, before we close, remind you that the next webinar is titled Urban Adaptation, Cities Adapting to Climate Change, and that takes place 2 to 3 p.m. on Wednesday, the 3rd of May. Thank you very much, and goodbye.